Ma'am, take off that necklace. Immediately. Judge Keller's voice rang out so sharply that the entire courtroom froze. He pointed straight at the woman seated in the third row as if calling out a person causing trouble. Sarah Cole did not stand, did not show defiance. She simply sat upright, her posture firm, her eyes impossibly calm. Around her neck, the pale blue ribbon with 13 white stars lay silent, striking against the dark fabric of her blouse. Keller's tone hardened, his patience gone. I said it already. That thing is not permitted in here. In front of her, Seaman Brooks turned back, tension written across his face. He knew exactly what the judge was insulting, and he knew he was powerless to stop it. Keller slammed another blow of authority onto the room. It looks like some trinket. Bailiff, prepare to confiscate it. The courtroom went dead quiet. No one dared breathe too loudly. Awkward, uneasy, and confused glances all drifted toward Sarah. She still didn't react. She spoke only 4 words, soft but sharp. It is permitted, sir. Keller curled his lip as if he had just been challenged. I'm the one who decides that here, and I say it is not permitted. The bailiff stepped toward her slowly, his face tightening with conflict. He knew an order was an order, but he also knew the thing resting on that woman's neck could never be treated like a piece of jewelry. Keller leaned forward and struck the gavel hard against the bench. That gaudy necklace will be taken off, by any means necessary. Sarah did not move, not a flicker of fear, not the slightest crease of her brow. The entire room was left with nothing but the sound of their own hearts pounding, because everyone there understood that a sacred boundary had just been crossed right in front of them. If you believe true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who've lived through war, then subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories to help us honor, preserve, and remember the quiet heroes of our nation. Sarah remained seated still as a stone that had endured a lifetime of storms. Not a single wasted movement. No resistance. No attempt to stand. No hand lifted to shield the medal resting on her chest. Her stillness was not reluctance, but a deliberate choice, as if she were saying that the most important truths often require no words. The pale blue ribbon lay quietly against her blouse, simple, sacred, and her calm presence made the air around her feel thick enough to choke on. The bailiff took a step toward her, then froze mid-stride. He looked into Sarah's eyes and saw there a strange kind of resolve not born of defiance, but of a steadiness shaped by years spent in places where every decision demanded a heavy price. In that brief moment, he understood that the thing she wore around her neck was not an ornament. It was the proof of something far beyond the imagination of those who had never seen war with their own eyes. And he felt with startling clarity that if he took one more step, he would be the first to cross a line he himself did not want to cross. Sarah's gaze drifted to the American flag standing beside the bench. That simple sight pulled her into a short, vivid stream of memory moments when she had stood at attention before a similar flag, moments when her unit had saluted in solemn silence as they sent a fallen comrade home, moments when she placed her hand over her heart and repeated a promise she intended to uphold with her life. She had never imagined that one day in a place meant to symbolize law and order, she would be treated like someone bringing something impure into the room. That feeling didn't make her angry. It made her sad that something meant to be understood and respected could be judged so carelessly because of one man's pride. Seaman Brooks turned his head, his face tight with worry. He opened his mouth, ready to speak, but Sarah shook her head just once, enough to tell him this wasn't his battlefield. He was too young to carry a burden that didn't belong to him. She didn't want him stepping into danger just to protect her. Once again, she chose silence. A silence that protected others, as she had done so many times before. Judge Keller couldn't bear that calm. This is a court of law, not a costume party, he barked again, his voice sharp as if he were trying to hold on to authority he felt slipping from his grasp. But Sarah didn't answer. She didn't frown. She didn't avoid his eyes. Her silence was a mirror held up to his insecurity, exposing the ignorance behind the authority he wielded. Inside the closed courtroom, people began to feel something rising beyond argument or disagreement. A boundary of dignity was being breached. The silence grew so heavy that those sitting along the benches hardly dared to shift their weight. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood they were witnessing something that should never happen to anyone who had ever worn the uniform of this country. There were no shouts, no resistance yet. A quiet form of defiance was spreading. Defiance born not from anger, but from a composure strong enough to force every person present to examine which side of that boundary they stood on. Sarah kept her eyes on the flag. She thought of the faces no longer here, of the long, exhausting days she had endured because she believed some things were worth protecting. And today what hurt her wasn't the unfair order. It was the coldness in the hearts of the people who should have understood the cost of sacrifice. Yet she stayed still, steady, like a candle, refusing to flicker, even when the wind pressed hard against it. When silence becomes too heavy to stand unmoved, the first thing it stirs is memory. And from that place, the door to the next chapter begins to open. Judge Keller leaned forward, his voice sharper and harder. "Remove the contraband! Detain her if needed!" Those words fell directly in front of Sarah like a blade striking the very thing she held sacred. Contraband. A sacred object that carried the lives of those she had saved, now being thrown into the same category as items seized from criminals. Keller wasn't finished. He pressed on, voice dripping with disdain. "That gaudy necklace will not stay here." Every word he uttered seemed crafted to strike exactly where it hurt most. Sarah felt those words settle heavily on her chest. Not out of fear, but out of the deep pain of someone who understood the price paid to earn that pale blue ribbon. Her expression did not change yet. Inside her, a storm door blew open. The smell of gunpowder returned. The scent of blood mixing with hot dirt. The whistling of rounds cutting through the air. An explosion close enough to ring her ears. She saw again the limp body of a young Marine slumped over her back as she tried to pull him out of a kill zone. She heard his broken breaths, heard him whisper an apology to his mother, heard her own heartbeat pounding wildly because every step she made could have been her last. The metal on her chest was not pride. It was a living scar, a reminder of Helmand, where everything could change with a single detonation. The thumping of a medevac helicopter rotor echoed in her memory, as if spinning just above her. It brought back the image of her blood-soaked hands trying desperately to keep a second Marine alive. Everything in Helmand had been sharp and real, every decision tied to real loss, and now the man sitting safely in a climate-controlled courtroom dared to call it a gaudy trinket. The humiliation was beyond words. At the clerk's desk, Daniel Cho felt his heart slam against his ribs. He had once been a Marine radio operator. He had studied the Medal of Honor in training sessions where entire platoons stood at rigid attention, staring straight ahead. It was something they all knew they would never touch, but also something no one ever disrespected. And now, in front of him, that pale blue ribbon was being threatened with seizure, as if it were a worthless piece of evidence. He had never seen such a blatant and brutal insult in his life. A woman who had saved 4 lives with her own body was being treated like someone carrying illegal contraband. The bailiff stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached toward Sarah. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult." His voice was small, as if even the sound might injure something sacred. Sarah looked at him with a thin, sorrowful smile, one that carried the weight of someone long familiar with injustice. "You're just doing your job," she said it softer than a breath. There was no blame in her voice, only the understanding of someone who had seen far harsher things. Everyone in the room could feel the tension stretching out, growing tighter and heavier with each passing second. No one dared interrupt. No one dared intervene. They looked at Sarah, a woman sitting straight-backed, with a calm that only those who have lived through catastrophe truly understand. And they looked at Keller, a man who continued to speak words that should never be spoken in front of a symbol he didn't comprehend. When humiliation pushes beyond the limit of what dignity can bear, there's always one young person who can no longer remain still, and the story begins to shift from that moment on. Daniel Cho felt his throat go dry as he watched Sarah being insulted again and again. He had been a Marine once. He had studied every line in the handbook about high-level decorations. He had listened to drill instructors read the names of Medal of Honor recipients with such solemn authority that no one dared even blink. And now that pale blue ribbon was being treated like confiscated property, and that single moment pushed him beyond the boundaries of an ordinary courtroom clerk. His hand trembled slightly as he reached under the desk for the phone he always kept silent during hearings. Today, he could not stay silent. He opened his contacts. There weren't many options, but one name stood out. The only person who would grasp the severity of what was happening. The only person he had trusted back in the unit. Master Gunnery Sergeant Reyes. When the call connected, Daniel lowered his voice to a whisper. "She's wearing the Medal of Honor. They're trying to take it." Just one sentence. But it was a sentence capable of shaking an entire naval base. The silence on the other end lasted only a few seconds, but it chilled Daniel's spine. Then Reyes barked sharp as steel, "Give me the address." "Now." Daniel spoke quickly, word by word. Reyes asked nothing more because to him, the Medal of Honor was not something to debate or reflect on. It was something to be protected immediately. One careless remark about it was already an insult. But this was far worse, a civilian judge ordering it ripped from the neck of someone who had saved 4 lives. Reyes shot up from his office chair and strode into the hallway without notifying anyone. He headed straight for the base chief of staff, breaking every protocol along the way. Within minutes, an emergency meeting came together on the strength of a single message: Medal of Honor. Civilian judge. Immediate threat. No one in the room questioned the legitimacy or the procedure. The base's captain looked directly at Reyes, recognizing the gravity in the man's hardened expression. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called the office of 4-star Admiral Marcus Hale. This was no longer a courtroom dispute. It had become a matter tied to national honor. In the diplomatic meeting room where Admiral Hale was receiving a foreign delegation, an aide walked in and placed a slip of paper in front of him. The message contained just one line: Master Chief Sarah Cole, judge ordering Medal of Honor confiscated. Admiral Hale read her name twice. It wasn't unfamiliar. He had read reports about her, had seen her photo in a commendation file he signed years ago. Those memories surged up so quickly that they darkened his expression on the spot. Without apology or explanation, he stood up. He told the delegation in a brief, firm tone that an urgent matter involving the honor of the United States Navy required his immediate attention. Then he turned to his aide and ordered, "Get my car. Full dress uniform. All of them." People in the room didn't know what was unfolding, but they all understood this was no ordinary situation. When a 4-star admiral said all of them, it meant an entire cadre of senior officers would follow him to wherever the Navy was needed. From that moment, Naval Base Coronado came alive like a great living body, awakened by a sacred signal. Officers were summoned. Dress uniforms were pulled on. Everyone present felt they were stepping into something far more than a duty. It was an obligation of honor. When people rise to protect something sacred, nothing can hold them back. And when an entire system moves in unison for one person, the next chapter of the story always begins with the arrival of those who carry the true weight of honor. The rear doors of the courtroom suddenly opened without a shout, without any announcement. There was only the steady sound of ceremonial shoes moving forward, an unmistakable sound to anyone who had ever stood in military formation. It echoed like the heartbeat of something immense and solemn. All eyes turned. The first figure to step inside was Admiral Marcus Hale, a 4-star flag officer of the United States Navy, entering with a calm yet commanding presence that seemed to shrink the entire room around him. Right behind him came Rear Admiral Lewis, chest lined with ribbons, and then Master Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, his dress blues pressed as sharp as a blade. Behind them stood a formation of officers and senior enlisted, all in full dress uniform, aligned with a discipline that left no doubt about who they were. No one in the courtroom uttered a word. No one understood fully what was happening, but everyone sensed that this arrival was no coincidence. The bailiff, who moments earlier had reached toward Sarah, snatched his hand back immediately, as if he'd brushed against something burning hot. He lowered his head to avoid Hale's gaze, shame flooding down his spine. Admiral Hale walked straight toward Sarah. His eyes never drifted to the judge's bench where Keller sat frozen. He did not glance at the stunned spectators. He looked only at Sarah, as if seeing through the years of combat he had once read in her service record. He stopped directly in front of her, standing tall, jaw set. And in that moment, the crowded room seemed to disappear, leaving only a retired Master Chief sitting quietly and a 4-star Admiral standing before her. Hale raised his hand slowly, but with total resolve. The salute was so sharp that those who witnessed it held their breath. A 4-star Admiral of the United States Navy saluting a retired enlisted sailor. A gesture reserved only for those who wear the Medal of Honor. The air tightened, stretched to the point of breaking. Keller forgot to breathe. Everyone in the courtroom stood frozen, afraid to even shift as they watched a ritual far larger than this small space unfold before them. Hale held the salute for several seconds, then lowered his hand. His voice came out clear, resonant, without effort. Master Chief Sarah Cole, United States Navy, retired. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if ensuring the judge heard every syllable. In an instant, the entire room understood that the woman being ordered to remove her medal was not some ordinary spectator. She was part of the history of the United States military, and they had just witnessed the absolute respect she commanded among those who knew the truth. Sarah said nothing. She simply looked at Hale, and the way their eyes met told everyone that the two of them shared things the rest of the room would never fully comprehend. Some stories can only be told through silence. Admiral Hale turned toward Judge Keller, but did not speak a single word to him. That silence weighed heavier than any reprimand. Keller lowered his head, gripping the edge of the bench, unable to look the Admiral in the eye. The officers behind Hale all adjusted their posture at once, as if to reinforce that they were not there to argue, but to restore the truth this courtroom had forgotten. A truth written in blood, in burning sand, in the unforgiving price of sacrifice. And with every gaze fixed on him, Hale prepared to say something no one in that courtroom was ready to hear, yet it was the only truth powerful enough to correct what had been twisted from the very beginning. Admiral Hale stood tall, his eyes fixed on Sarah as he began to speak. I will now read the Medal of Honor citation awarded to Master Chief Sarah Cole. No one in the courtroom moved. His voice rang out clear like a solemn oath. Helmand Valley, Afghanistan, 2012. He paused for a beat, then continued. During a brutal ambush, her unit was pinned under heavy enemy fire. 3 Marines were trapped outside the defensive perimeter, fully exposed to direct enemy fire. His voice did not waver. Sarah Cole ran into the kill zone the first time. She used her own body to shield the first Marine and was wounded when shrapnel tore through her armor. Despite the pain, she dragged him out of danger. Absolute silence filled the room. Hale went on each word laid down with the weight of sacrifice. After getting the first Marine to safety, she went back a second time. Under intense fire, she knelt to treat the second Marine right there in the open. When the enemy's fire paused for a moment, she pulled him back to cover, despite the wound on her shoulder bleeding heavily. Keller looked down at his desk, as if trying to hide from every sentence the Admiral spoke. But Admiral Hale offered him no escape. The third time, she ran out to pull the remaining Marine back toward the team. The enemy spotted her and focused their fire on her. She was shot again in the same shoulder the shrapnel had already torn through. Hale's fingers tightened. Even then, she returned fire with her sidearm, stopping a machine gun position that was endangering the entire unit. A choked sob came from the front row. Seaman Brooks raised a hand to wipe his tears, too overwhelmed to hide them. He stood there listening to the story of the woman who had defended him moments earlier in this courtroom, realizing she had defended others before him with her own blood. At the clerk's desk, Daniel Cho instinctively straightened his posture, shoulders squaring as if he were back in the barracks. He looked at Sarah with a level of respect words could never fully express. Hale read the final line of the citation, his voice lowering. Her actions directly saved the lives of 4 Marines. 4 men alive. 4 families spared from receiving a folded flag. He turned his head toward Keller, who now sat motionless, drained of all color. And the thing you called a trinket, Hale paused, his gaze sharp as a blade, is the highest honor this nation can bestow upon a service member. No one dared take a deep breath. No one dared blink. The words dropped into the center of the room like a stone shattering the flimsy pride Keller had clung to since the start of the hearing. Then Hale delivered the final blow, undeniable and absolute. The order you gave was not only unlawful, it was an insult to honor and sacrifice. It was dishonorable, and no one who serves or has ever served will tolerate that. Sarah sat quietly, her eyes steady. She had heard these words before years ago in a formal ceremony when the president read the citation before the entire branch of service. But here in this small room in the midst of raw disrespect, the meaning of those words cut deeper. They were no longer a record of valor. They were a reminder of a truth no one had the right to distort. Keller could no longer speak. His hands trembled. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant words he had spoken earlier now weighed on him like chains. Those in the courtroom looked at him not with anger, but with disappointment. A silence heavier than any accusation settled over him. And in that moment, with the truth laid bare before them, the room turned toward the only person who had earned the right to speak next, the one who had lived every moment of what had just been read aloud. Sarah placed both hands on the chair and rose to her feet, her body tilting slightly as the old wound in her left shoulder flared again. Every time she moved too quickly, that bullet wound reminded her of the price she had once paid, yet she still stood tall, refusing to let anyone see weakness. The room fell silent when she stood. No one spoke. No one knew what she would say. But everyone understood this moment belonged to her. Sarah did not turn to Admiral Hale even though he stood right beside her. She did not look at the officers lined up behind him. She looked directly at Judge Keller, the man who just minutes ago had tried to rip the Medal of Honor from her neck, as if confiscating contraband. Her gaze held no anger, only the weary sadness of someone who had seen too many unfortunate things born from a lack of understanding. Your Honor, Sarah said slowly, her voice low but firm. I respect the law. I spent 30 years upholding it. In the stillness of the courtroom, her words stood upright like a steel pillar. They were not self-defense. They were truth. Keller swallowed hard, his eyes widening as if he no longer knew where to look. Sarah continued, neither raising nor softening her voice. Standards mean nothing without wisdom. Each word landed like a hammer against his pride. Don't soften them, just be better at recognizing them. It was not an accusation. It was a reminder from someone who had lived long enough to understand the worth of discipline and responsibility, and the cost when ignorance hides behind authority. Keller did not move. His face drained of color. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if something heavier than any sentence had just settled on him. For the first time in the entire hearing, he understood that he had been profoundly wrong. Not just legally wrong, but wrong in the very values a justice system claims to uphold. His silence was the silence of a man realizing he had stood on the wrong side of a moral line. Sarah said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her words were not meant to humiliate him. They were meant to restore the truth to the room that the law could never stand above the dignity of those who had given their own bodies to protect it. The entire courtroom watched her, as though witnessing a ceremony they themselves were not worthy to interrupt. She remained calm as if she were accustomed to letting truth speak in her place. It was the calm of someone who had carried the weight of another human life on her back, who had bled so others could live one more day, who knew that some lessons can only be taught through lived suffering, not through books. Keller lowered his head. For the first time in the hearing, he no longer hid behind the robe of a judge. He stood like a man carrying the burden of his own remorse. No one in the room wanted to shame him further. But everyone could see the transformation happening inside him, a transformation that needed to happen. Sarah looked at him for one more heartbeat, then drew in a gentle breath. She had not come here to defeat anyone. She simply wanted to remind him that respect does not come from authority, but from the ability to recognize what truly deserves to be honored. And when she sat back down, the courtroom had barely taken its first breath, before realizing that her lesson would not end with a few sentences. It would bring real consequences, along with the chance for a man to make things right in the final chapter of the story. After Sarah sat down, Judge Keller remained standing for a long moment, frozen like a man whose breath had just been taken away. When he finally opened his mouth again, his voice was far smaller than it had been only minutes earlier. Contempt is dismissed. He spoke without daring to look at Sarah. His hand trembled as he signed the paper in front of him. Seaman Brooks's citation is dismissed as well. No one in the room objected. No whispers. No murmurs. Everyone simply watched in silence as the man tried to correct a small part of the wrong he had done. When Keller declared the court adjourned, no one stood up immediately. No one spoke. A strange silence spread, not of tension, but of respect and a shared sense of shame for what they had all witnessed. In the days that followed, news of the incident traveled through the legal and military communities faster than any formal report. Keller was summoned before the Judicial Review Board. His censure was approved almost instantly. The document did not contain harsh words, but enough for any judge to understand he had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The county courthouse implemented a new policy. All judges, attorneys, and staff were now required to undergo training on medal recognition, military history protocols involving the Medal of Honor, and the legal rights of those who wear it. It was a small change, but a necessary one, and it began with the silence of a woman sitting in the third row. A month later, Sarah was shopping in the base commissary. Her hand brushed a box of cereal when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned, and there stood Keller, no longer in his black robe, but in plain civilian clothes. He looked noticeably older. The aggression he had displayed that day was gone. Only fatigue and regret remained in his eyes. He held the brim of his cap and exhaled a long, unsteady breath. Master Chief Cole. His voice cracked. I want to apologize. My ignorance was profound. When he finished, he bowed his head as if standing before something more sacred than his own position. Sarah looked at him for a long time, not with anger, not with resentment, with the calmness of someone who had seen too much pain to make room for hatred. She replied, "What matters is what you do now. Just that. No bitterness, no revisiting the mistake." A short sentence, but enough to place responsibility back where it belonged in the choices a person makes once they know they were wrong. Keller nodded. He said nothing more. He turned and walked away, slow and heavy, as if every step was an effort to remember a lesson everyone must learn. At least once in life, authority can be given to anyone, but honor cannot. Sarah watched him for a few seconds, then returned to her cart. She didn't need to see him change. She didn't need praise or permission. She only needed to know that what she had said, what she had lived through, what she had lost, had reached the right person at the right moment. Not to win an argument, but to spark a quiet, powerful change, just as she had lived her entire military life. She pushed her cart forward, merging into the flow of people in the commissary. Those who passed her greeted her with a small nod, not because she wore a rare medal, but because they knew she was part of their history, someone who had kept her oath when it mattered most. And as she stepped out of the final aisle, her story did not end. It became something that would leave a long-lasting footprint, even though she never once sought it. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story made you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.